Have you ever seen a man who never cried tremble at the sight of a smile? He smiled at me, doctor, even knowing he was about to die. John's voice barely came out, choked by the silence in the room. The doctor didn't respond. She just held his hand tightly. That CEO, so used to pushing emotions aside, now trembled at a moment he'd never forget, his father's fragile smile, just moments from passing, offered by a woman he didn't even know. And in that instant, everything he believed about love, power, and control came crashing down. Have you ever lived a moment like this? Like the video? Leave a comment below, share this story, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The sound of John's Italian shoes echoed through the corridors of Richardson Holdings with the same precision as his calendar. Every step was a reflection of a hyper-efficient mind, a schedule polished to perfection, and a heart locked behind steel walls. To him, emotions were noise, and noise got in the way of business. Feelings were distractions, and distractions cost money. His office felt more like a glass and steel temple than a space for people. No family photos, no childhood memories, just spreadsheets, graphs, and multi-million-dollar contracts. John was known as the most effective CEO in the industry, and the coldest. A suit-wearing robot, employees whispered down the hall, unaware he could hear them. Not that he minded. He liked it that way. Romantic relationships? Please. Not worth the time. He'd learned early that vulnerability was dangerous. His mother's love had been ripped away too soon, and his father, while physically present, had always been emotionally absent. John was raised on structure, not affection. So he'd made a vow, don't feel, just win. It worked. Until one unexpected phone call shattered everything. That morning, he was reviewing a billion-dollar merger when his phone rang. The caller ID read, Dad's Residence. He hesitated for a second, then answered in the same tone he used to close deals. But this wasn't a negotiation. On the other end was a shaky nurse's voice. Mr. Richardson, your father was admitted early this morning. It's serious. His breath caught. He stayed composed on the outside, but something cracked inside. His brain switched to damage control, top-tier specialists, private clinics, overseas consultations, anything money could buy. But a creeping dread pressed down on him, deeper than anything he could quantify. For once, his wealth felt useless. Book the jet, he told his assistant without blinking. In seconds, his day's agenda was cancelled. It was the first time in years he'd broken his rigid routine. As the car raced toward the airport, memories he thought were buried started to resurface. His father's distant laughter, a busted bicycle, an awkward half-hug, all things that once meant something, maybe still did. The hospital was in another city, and the flight gave him time to rehearse what he might say. But the words didn't come. I came to see you. I'm sorry I wasn't around. I love you. None of them fit right in his mouth. Truth was, he didn't remember how to be a son. When he arrived, the sterile smell of antiseptic hit him like a punch. The cold white walls reminded him of corporate lobbies, but here they screamed of fragility. He followed the nurse through narrow halls until he reached the ICU. There he saw his father, lying still, eyes closed, the once commanding man reduced to a frail body beneath a thin blanket. John didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring at the man he had feared, respected, but never truly knew. The heart monitor pulsed slowly beside the bed, each beep landing like a hammer in his chest. For the first time in his adult life, John had no power, no plan, no fix. What he didn't know yet was that what would change him forever wasn't the nearness of death, but the entrance of a woman who'd make his father smile. The door clicked shut behind him. John stood still, watching his father's body, pale and unmoving, tangled in tubes and machines. The heart monitor beeped rhythmically, steady, cold, mechanical. This man who once ruled boardrooms now couldn't lift a finger, and his son, who'd conquered everything, had no idea how to comfort him. John did what he always did. He went into problem-solving mode, called 3 palliative care specialists, emailed Zurich's best hospital, reached out to a former med school professor at Harvard. All his contacts responded immediately. He was a Richardson, after all. But their answers were the same. There's nothing more we can do. A nurse hovered nearby, quietly observing him with gentle eyes. Would you like one of our doctors to explain the details? John nodded, barely glancing her way. His focus stayed on his father. Was he always like this? He asked. She paused. Too strong, even when he didn't need to be. But today, he just needs someone to be here. Then she left, leaving the silence heavier than before. Alone in the room, John pulled a chair beside the bed. He raised his hand to touch his father's, but stopped mid-air. He didn't know if he was allowed. Didn't know how. Dad, I'm here. His voice cracked. No script, no armor, just raw, uncomfortable truth. His father didn't respond. His eyelids fluttered once but didn't open. It was too early to say goodbye and too late to start over. He glanced at his phone. Dozens of emails blinked back at him. For a moment he tried to dive into them, anything to avoid feeling this helpless, but for the first time he couldn't. He shut it off, stared at the ceiling. That inner truth, sharp and undeniable, pierced him. He didn't know how to care, didn't know how to love. He only knew how to win. And here, winning didn't matter. Then the door creaked open. A soft figure walked in. No lab coat, just a badge and a calm presence. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice low, warm. John glanced up, guarded. She didn't seem to notice. Instead, she walked straight to the bed, took Richard's hand and said, "Mr. Richardson, I'm back with today's story, remember?" John frowned. Story? The woman, a doctor, he realized, began telling a tale about a stubborn goat that crashed a soccer game. Her tone was soothing, her expressions gentle, and somehow, impossibly, Richard smiled. A faint, fragile, unmistakable smile. It was the first smile John had seen on his father's face in months. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. That smile wasn't earned through treatment or wealth. It came from something he didn't know how to give. Presence, kindness, humanity. The realization struck him like a silent slap. A crack in the armor he'd worn all his life. Emily, that was her name on the badge. She finished her story, adjusted his father's pillow, and only then looked at John. "You must be his son." He nodded. "I'm Dr. Emily. Your dad and I talk a lot when he's awake. He mentions you. More than you'd think." And with that, she turned and left as quietly as she'd come. But she left behind more than silence. She left him a question that wouldn't leave his mind. Who was this woman? Who could do in minutes what he never could? Emily walked the hospital halls like she belonged there, not with arrogance, but with a calm confidence that softened everything around her. She didn't wear heavy makeup or heels. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her sneakers squeaked slightly as she moved. But when she stepped into a room, people breathed easier. It wasn't magic. It was presence. John noticed her again later that day, sitting on a bench near the vending machine. She was laughing with an elderly patient, holding 2 small juice boxes like it was the most natural thing in the world. Something about the ease in her posture unsettled him. He had spent years mastering power dynamics, but this was something else entirely. She didn't command the room. She connected with it. That night, he returned to his father's room and found a small drawing taped to the wall. A child's scribble. In the corner, Emily's handwriting. He said this reminded him of you. Messy, fast, and full of potential. It didn't make sense, but somehow It stung. The thought that his father was sharing parts of himself with a stranger while their own connection had faded to silence made his chest tighten. The next morning, he waited near the nurse station, pretending to read a chart he didn't care about. When Emily passed by, he spoke before he could second-guess himself. "Dr. Emily." She turned with a warm smile. "Yes?" He cleared his throat. "I just wanted to thank you for yesterday." She tilted her head slightly. "You're welcome." He needed it. He nodded awkwardly, unsure what else to say. "How do you do it?" She blinked. "Do what?" "Make someone like him smile like that." Her smile softened. "I don't try to fix people, I just sit with them. Sometimes that's enough." And just like that, she excused herself and walked away, leaving him more shaken than any hostile takeover ever had. That evening, John found himself hovering outside the staff break room, listening to her voice as she shared a story with the night nurses. They were laughing, genuinely, loudly. It felt foreign to him, that kind of joy in the middle of so much pain. He realized how much he'd insulated himself from moments like this, messy, unpredictable, human. Back in his hotel room, he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his reflection. For the first time, he didn't recognize the man in the mirror. Not the expensive suit, not the perfect tie, just tired eyes and a growing storm in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling. And now he couldn't stop. Emily had cracked something open without trying, a presence, a gesture, a damn goat story. And somehow he felt more exposed than in any boardroom. And the worst part? He didn't hate it. He was curious, drawn, afraid, because if she could make his father smile, what else could she change? John sat by the window of the hospital cafe, watching the rain slide down the glass like slow tears. He hadn't touched his coffee. His phone vibrated with meeting alerts, reminders, and unanswered emails. But for once, he didn't move. His world, once built on order and execution, now felt like it was running in the background while his heart stumbled through unfamiliar territory. He thought about his childhood. His mother had died young, too young to leave lasting memories. Her face was a blur, her scent gone, her voice erased. After her, it had just been Richard. A man who didn't do hugs, who taught through silence, and who believed that emotions were only useful if they made you tougher. John learned early that love wasn't something to lean on. It was something that left. As a teenager, he stopped asking for affection. He poured himself into achievements, top of his class, Ivy League, youngest executive in the company. The praise replaced the warmth he never had. Success became his safety net. If people feared him, they wouldn't leave him. If he stayed in control, nothing could hurt him. At least that's what he thought. But Emily was different. She didn't flirt. She didn't flatter. She didn't even seem particularly impressed by who he was. And yet, something in the way she looked at him, without expectation or judgment, unraveled his defenses. It wasn't attraction. It was recognition. Like she could see the cracks he worked so hard to cover. He started showing up earlier at the hospital. Sometimes he pretended to read medical journals in the waiting room, just to catch a glimpse of her during rounds. Once, she sat beside him, both sipping coffee in silence. No words, just breathing in the same air. And that silence felt more honest than most of the conversations he'd had in his entire adult life. Richard noticed, of course. One afternoon, he smirked and whispered, "She's too kind for someone like you." John had chuckled, dry, uncomfortable. "You think I scare her?" Richard shrugged. "I think she sees you." And that shook John more than he cared to admit, because being seen meant being known, and being known, that was terrifying. The more time he spent near Emily, the more memories surfaced, not just of his father's cold stares, but of his own quiet choices, how he ghosted women after first dates, how he mocked vulnerability in others, how he replaced connection with contracts. He hadn't just avoided love, He had feared it. One evening, after Richard had fallen asleep, John stayed behind. Emily walked in, surprised to see him still there. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She nodded. "Do you ever get scared of caring too much?" Her answer was simple. "Every day. But not caring. That scares me more." Then she smiled gently and walked away. John sat there long after she left, haunted by her words. Something inside him was shifting, slowly, uncomfortably, but undeniably. And for the first time he wondered, what if love wasn't a weakness? John started paying more attention, not just to Emily, but to the space around her. He watched how she greeted every patient by name, how she remembered birthdays, how she sat on the edge of the bed and listened like there was nowhere else she'd rather be. He didn't understand it, but it drew him in like gravity. It was like watching someone fluent in a language he'd never learned. In his father's room, Emily would talk about simple things, the flowers outside, a funny nurse, a show Richard used to love. She never brought up death, never made it heavy, and yet she treated each moment like it mattered. John couldn't help but compare that to the way he lived, racing through life, measuring time by the hour, never pausing to breathe. One afternoon, John mustered the courage to ask her something real. They were walking side by side toward the cafeteria when he said, "Why do you do this? I mean, this job. It looks like it eats people alive." Emily smiled without looking at him. "Because it's real. Pain doesn't lie. Neither does love. You see people for who they really are in moments like this." That answer sat with him all day. He found himself thinking about how little he actually knew his own father. What had Richard loved as a kid? Did he have regrets? Was he proud? John had never asked. It wasn't their dynamic. They talked business, strategy, numbers, but never the human stuff. And now, it might be too late. That night, Emily brought in a small radio and played an old jazz tune his father used to hum under his breath. John blinked. "How did you know he liked that?" She shrugged. "He mentioned it once when he was half asleep." Some things stick. John sat down beside her, quieter this time. The song filled the room like warmth. "Do you ever feel like you missed something?" he asked her. She turned to him, surprised. "Like what?" "Like a whole part of your life you didn't even know you needed until it was too late." Emily's face softened. "All the time. But that's the gift of moments like these. They show you what you've been missing." For a long time, John believed that emotions were tools, useful only if they served a purpose. But Emily didn't try to impress him. She didn't use grand gestures. Her kindness was subtle, layered, and terrifyingly powerful. She treated him like a person, not a CEO, and it made him question everything. He looked at his father differently now, not as a failed parent or a distant figure, but as a man, fragile and full of stories never told. For the first time, John wanted to ask questions, not for closure, but for connection, even if the answers never came. But just as he was learning how to feel, life was about to remind him how easily it could all be taken away. The hospital started to feel familiar in a way that both comforted and unsettled John. He knew the hum of the vending machine near the elevators, the sound of the night shift nurses laughing softly at 2 a.m., the scent of coffee that was always just a little burnt. But more than anything, he recognized her. Emily. Her presence became an anchor, something steady in the storm he hadn't even realized he was drowning in. They rarely spoke for long, but their silences became filled with meaning. A shared glance in the hallway, a brief nod over stale cafeteria food. One night, he held the door for her without thinking, and when their hands brushed, she didn't pull away. Neither did he. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. It was human, real. In the stillness of Richard's room, Emily would sit beside John and just exist with him. No advice, no expectations. Sometimes she'd read aloud from a book she found in the hospital library. Sometimes they said nothing at all, and in that nothingness, John felt more connected than he had in years of high-powered meetings and shallow dates. One afternoon, Richard was more alert than usual. His voice rasped as he looked at Emily, then at John. "You two make quite the pair," he said, his eyes twinkling despite the oxygen tube. John gave a tight smile. "She's just your doctor." Richard coughed a laugh. "Son, if I had $1 for every time I said that about your mother—" John froze. Emily looked away, respectfully giving them space. Later, in the hallway, John leaned against the wall beside her. "He never talks like that. Not about Mom. Not about anything." Emily just smiled. "Sometimes when people are close to the end, they start choosing honesty over pride." Her words struck deep, because John wasn't sure he even knew how to be honest, with others or with himself. Over time, the weight he carried began to shift, not disappear, but shift. He started looking forward to their brief encounters. Sometimes he'd catch himself replaying things she'd said, trying to make sense of them long after she walked away. He began to notice things, her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the softness in her eyes that didn't match the chaos of a hospital. But then came the call. John had stepped out to take a quick meeting call, just 5 minutes. When he came back, the nurse at the desk looked at him with quiet urgency. "You need to go to room 204. Now." His stomach dropped. He rushed down the hall, heart pounding. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until he saw Emily standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. Richard was fading. Machines beeped in erratic rhythms. His breathing was shallow. John stepped inside, but Emily didn't look at him. She looked at Richard, holding his hand, whispering something only he could hear. John moved closer, frozen by the fear that he had waited too long to say what mattered most. This was it. And deep down, he knew he might be too late. John didn't make it in time. By the time he reached his father's bedside, Richard's eyes were closed for the final time. The machines were silent. No rhythmic beeps, no shallow breaths, just stillness. Emily sat beside him, her hand still wrapped gently around his. Her expression wasn't shocked. It was tender, full of reverence, like she had just witnessed something sacred. John froze at the threshold. His feet didn't move. His mouth went dry. The room felt colder than it had ever been. All the things he thought he would say, "I forgive you," "I love you," "Thank you," died in his throat. He hadn't just lost a father. He'd lost the chance to make peace, to ask the questions, to hear the answers. Emily stood slowly. Her eyes met his, soft and glassy. "He went peacefully," she whispered. "He wasn't afraid. He smiled." Those words gutted him, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind, and kindness hurt when you knew you didn't deserve it. John stepped closer, staring at the hand she had been holding, the one he had been too afraid to touch. He reached out and gently laid his palm over it. It was already cold, and yet a strange warmth bloomed in his chest. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was gratitude, maybe both. "I should have been here," he said, voice breaking for the first time in years. Emily didn't respond with platitudes. She didn't tell him it was okay. She just placed her hand over his and held it, letting him grieve without interruption. In that moment he cried, not just for his father, but for the boy who never got to say goodbye. The funeral was small, private, and efficient, just like Richard would have wanted. John barely spoke. He stood like stone while others wept. The headlines the next morning read, "Powerful CEO mourns father's death in private ceremony." But what they didn't know was that the most powerful moment didn't happen at the funeral. It happened in that hospital room. With a smile. After the burial, John approached Emily in the garden, where she often took her breaks. She was sitting alone, head tilted to the sky. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being there, for him." She turned to him, surprised but calm. "It was an honor. He talked about you a lot, you know. He looked down. I wish I had done the same. Then he walked away. No confession, no dramatic plea, just space, because in his mind he wasn't ready for anything else. What he didn't realize was that distancing himself didn't protect him from pain, it deepened it. But he wasn't used to being vulnerable, so he did what he always did when emotions overwhelmed him. He disappeared into work, but this time the silence followed him. John threw himself into work like a man trying to outrun a shadow. Within days of the funeral, he was back at the office, suit pressed, inbox cleared, meetings stacked from morning till midnight. To the outside world he looked unstoppable, but inside something was unraveling. The noise of the boardroom no longer drowned out the quiet ache in his chest. He sat through conference calls and strategic briefings, nodding at charts he didn't care about. His mind wandered constantly, to that hospital room, to the drawing Emily had taped to the wall, to the smile his father gave her. He found himself zoning out mid-sentence, forgetting names, misplacing documents. Things that had once been second nature now felt hollow. At night, his penthouse felt colder than usual. The view, once a symbol of his success, now looked like a glass box floating above a city he no longer connected with. He couldn't sleep. The silence echoed louder than any city noise, and in that silence he saw his father's face, smiling, fading, and Emily's voice saying he wasn't afraid. He tried everything to distract himself. New investments, new projects, even a charity gala with flashbulbs and champagne, but nothing stuck. People asked how he was holding up. He'd smile and say, all good. But every time someone said, sorry for your loss, he felt like screaming, because it wasn't just about losing his father. It was about losing time, losing meaning. One night he opened a drawer in his study and found an old photo of them, Richard holding him as a baby. He barely remembered that version of his father, and yet it stirred something in him. For the first time, he wondered what his father had felt all those years, behind the stern looks and distant voice. Had he loved him, just in his own rigid way? That question clung to him for days. He even dreamed about it, sitting in the hospital again, but this time the room was empty. Emily wasn't there. His father wasn't there. Just a chair facing the window and the sound of jazz playing softly in the background. He woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. The next morning, something shifted. He cancelled 2 meetings, shut his laptop, and stood up without a plan. His assistant blinked. Sir, do you want me to reschedule the call with Singapore? John didn't answer. He just said, hold my calls, and walked out. An hour later, he stood in front of the hospital, the same entrance, same scent of antiseptic. But now, everything looked different, not physically, but emotionally. He wasn't here to control anything. He was here because he missed something. Someone. He didn't know what he'd say. He didn't even know if she'd be there. But for the first time in years, he was following his heart, not his calendar. And something told him it wasn't too late. John found her in the hospital garden, exactly where he'd hoped she'd be. Emily sat on a weathered bench, coffee in hand, reading a book worn at the edges. The sun filtered through the trees, casting patches of light across her face. She didn't notice him at first. For a moment he just watched her, unsure of what to say, afraid of ruining the quiet peace she carried. When she finally looked up, she blinked in surprise. John? He gave a small nod, suddenly feeling 15 instead of 40. Hey, he said, I didn't call, I just needed to come. She closed her book gently and gestured to the spot beside her. He sat down, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I've been thinking about everything, he began. About my dad, about you, about the silence I've lived in for so long. She didn't rush him, just listened. He looked at his hands. I was raised to believe emotions were distractions, but lately, not feeling anything feels like the real failure. Emily's gaze didn't waver. You don't have to apologize, she said softly. Grief doesn't follow rules, neither does healing. He glanced sideways at her. You're good at this, sitting in hard places. She smiled faintly. It's part of the job. But some people make me want to stay longer. That landed harder than she probably intended. His throat tightened. You helped my father feel peace in the end. And you helped me see myself. She looked down, touched by the vulnerability in his voice. Thank you, he whispered, for being there when I couldn't be. She shook her head. He knew you loved him, even when you didn't say it. I saw it in the way his eyes lit up when you walked in. He wasn't looking for perfect words, John. He was just looking for you. For the first time, John allowed those words to sink in without pushing them away. They didn't hurt. They healed. He looked at her then, really looked. Would you like to have coffee sometime, outside these hospital walls? Her smile was quiet, but it reached her eyes. I'd like that. For a moment, they just sat there in the golden silence, two people who had seen both endings and beginnings in the same place. Something about it felt honest. No pressure, no titles, just two souls meeting in the middle. But before they could take another step, Emily hesitated. There's something I haven't told you, she said. John turned to her, heart beating faster. What is it? Her next words would test everything they'd just begun to build. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the bench. I got an offer, she said quietly. John's brow furrowed. An offer? She nodded. To lead a humanitarian medical program, overseas. 6 months, maybe a year. Remote villages, no Wi-Fi, no suits, no skyscrapers. Just people who need help. He felt the air shift between them. Of course, someone like her would be chosen for something like that. It made perfect sense. And yet, his chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to fear. When do you leave? He asked. I haven't decided, she said, eyes locked on his. But they need an answer by the end of the week. John looked away. Everything in him wanted to say, stay. But he knew what that would mean. It would mean caging a woman who was born to run free. And after all the walls he'd spent his life building, the last thing he wanted was to become someone else's cage, especially hers. I'm not going to ask you to give that up, he said finally, voice low. If anything, I'm proud of you. It's exactly the kind of thing I'd never have had the courage to do. Emily watched him for a long moment. That's the thing, John. You're braver than you think. Most people run from feeling. You're leaning into it. He gave a small, bittersweet smile. It's messy. I don't know how to do any of this. I'm used to spreadsheets and control, not coffee dates and unpredictable women who change everything I thought I knew. She laughed softly, and the tension cracked just a little. You're doing better than you think. As the week passed, John found himself walking through his life differently. He noticed things, paused more, talked less. He even found himself at his father's grave one morning, just sitting in the quiet, letting the breeze carry the words he never got to say. And somehow that silence felt less heavy than it used to. The night before Emily's decision was due, John waited outside the hospital. He didn't text, didn't call, just waited. When she finally stepped out, she looked surprised, but not unhappy. You came, he nodded. I just wanted you to know that whatever you decide, I'll be okay. But if you stay, he paused, swallowing hard, I'd like to know what this could become. Emily stepped closer. And if I go? She asked. He smiled gently. Then I'll be cheering you on from here. Maybe writing long-winded emails and pretending I don't care how long you take to reply. She laughed, then grew quiet. What if I told you I want to stay? John blinked. You do? She nodded slowly. I've spent years running toward purpose. And now, For the first time, I feel like I've found someone who makes me want to stop and stay still for a while." His heart thudded in his chest. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. They stood there, under a pale street lamp, with the night pressing in around them, not as a threat but as a soft promise of something new. They weren't perfect, they weren't sure, but they were present, and that was enough. Still, the future held one final surprise, one they didn't see coming. John wasn't the same man he had been weeks ago, and everyone around him felt it. His assistants noticed it in the way he now said, "Thank you," without rushing. His board noticed it when he listened without interrupting. Even his driver noticed the difference. John rolled the window down and asked about his daughter's college plans. It wasn't a personality change. It was something deeper, a shedding of old armor. He didn't just go back to work. He returned with intention. One of his first acts as CEO was to create a fund in honor of his father, focused on medical care for the elderly in underprivileged areas. "Because dignity," he said at the launch, "shouldn't be a luxury." The board applauded, but it wasn't about the headlines. It was personal. Emily stood in the back during that speech, her eyes misty. Afterward, he found her by the coffee table, trying to hide the emotion. "You okay?" he asked, handing her a napkin. "You made me cry in front of half of Wall Street," she teased. He grinned. "Guess I'm finally learning how to cause tears for the right reasons." They started spending real time together, walking in the park, cooking badly in his high-end kitchen, reading next to each other in peaceful silence. It was a different kind of wealth, one not measured in millions, but in presence, in laughter, in the warmth of knowing someone was truly there. John began reworking the company's culture too. He met with junior staff, asked about their lives, offered scholarships to single parents pursuing degrees. He wasn't trying to be a hero, just human. For the first time, his leadership came from empathy, not ego, and people noticed. But more importantly, he noticed. Every now and then, he still struggled. Old habits didn't vanish overnight. He'd catch himself retreating into work, shutting off. But now, Emily was there, and she didn't fix him. She simply stayed. With her, he never had to perform. He could be the man behind the title. One evening, as they watched the sunset from his balcony, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "I almost left, you know," she whispered. "I know," he said. "But I'm really glad you didn't." She smiled. "Me too." He kissed the top of her head, no longer afraid of what that gesture meant. Love, he was learning, didn't demand perfection, just presence. He started writing letters to his father, not to send, just to feel. "Today I remembered the jazz song you loved," he wrote in one. "Emily plays it sometimes. I think you would have liked her. You smiled when she was near. And now I do too." The act of writing became a quiet ritual, a way to keep healing. But just as things felt steady, life had one more card to play. A knock at the door, a delivery, a photo. That would unravel a secret from the past. Years passed quietly, not with the rush of corporate deadlines, but with the soft rhythm of ordinary love. John stood near the window of the nursery, holding his newborn son in his arms. The baby's breath was warm against his chest, his tiny fingers curling around John's thumb. Emily stood beside him, her eyes tired but glowing. The room smelled of baby lotion and hope. On the wall above the crib was a single photo in a simple wooden frame. Richard, his father, smiling. Not the stoic smirk from business galas, but that rare, almost forgotten smile he'd given Emily in the hospital room. John had asked her to take the photo the day it happened. He never said why, but now it was clear. That smile was the seed of everything. John often thought about how differently his life could have gone if he hadn't answered that phone call, If he'd arrived a moment too late, if Emily hadn't told that ridiculous story about the goat on the soccer field. But the thing about life-changing moments is, they never announce themselves. They sneak in, disguised as silence, or a story, or a smile. He was no longer the man who measured success by how many people he could impress. He measured it now in bedtime stories, in Sunday morning pancakes, in the way Emily's hand still reached for his under the table when she laughed too hard. Love, he had learned, isn't loud. It's consistent, steady, kind. Emily sat on the floor, gently rocking the baby in her arms while their toddler ran circles around the couch. "You look like your grandfather when you get that serious face," she teased. John chuckled. "God help me," he said, but the warmth in his voice betrayed the affection behind the joke. In that moment, watching his family bloom in a world he once feared to enter, he knew he hadn't just learned how to feel, he'd learned how to live. And somewhere, wherever souls go, he hoped his father could see it. Because that one smile had changed everything. Have you ever met someone cold who shows no emotions at all? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your story. And if this story touched you, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for more stories like this one. See you in the next video. And in the next episode, you'll meet someone who had to choose between forgiving or disappearing forever.